In the early 1900s, what we now know as Northbridge was very much a Chinatown, and Northbridge has always been seen now as that part of town where the new migrants went to. In the 1900s it was the Chinese, and then later on it became other groups. As a consequence, the Chinese congregated in this area because there were old boarding houses, there was restaurants, there were herbalists, there was even a furniture factory, and at one stage there was even a Chinese undertaker. So there was all sorts of different businesses besides grocery businesses. My name's Kayleen Poon. I'm third generation Australian-born Chinese, and I was born in Western Australia in 1956. Currently I work as a local history officer for the City of Melbourne. Hop Hing and Company was a Chinese business that started in what we now know as Northbridge in 1902, and it was started by a gentleman by the name of Charles Hing in association with another Chinese gentleman, Xing Hong, and it was a Chinese grocery shop. So it was in James Street, and over a period of time there were different owners and operators because the Chinese weren't really encouraged to stay in Western Australia at that time. My father went to Sydney, that's where he met my mother, so his name was John Fong, and both he and Win decided to come back, and I think at that stage his uncle was in the shop, Henley Fong, so they came along and they took it over, and at that time there were very, very few younger Chinese, they were all mainly elderly, and they came in 1954 to take it on, and then I was born in 1956, and then my two younger brothers followed after that. The Hop Hing, by the time my parents took it over, was situated right next door to the Chung Wah Association. And post-Second World War, there was quite a large exodus of Chinese. So the club had gone into recess. And as a consequence, because my parents' shop was right next door and they were kind of the younger generation, the store became a de facto meeting place. Whereas before people would go to the Chung Wah to read newspapers or just socialise, they started doing that at my parents' shop. And quite often we would have just elderly Chinese men coming in, and they would sit down with my father or both my parents, have a cup of tea and have a chat and wait for someone else to come along, and then they would have a chat. And as a consequence, if any of them needed any assistance, some of them would get arrested for smoking opium and have to go to court. My father would do the translation because there was no one to do translating for them. If they needed to go to the Royal Perth Hospital to have treatment, he would accompany them so that the doctors could explain what was going to be happening, and then my father would translate both ways. There weren't many Chinese in Western Australia, and that was due to the early history of the gold rushes in the eastern states. And when gold was found in Western Australia, or the Swan River Colony as it was then known, laws were introduced to prohibit anyone of colour getting a miner's permit. And there was also restrictions on the number of Chinese just coming into the colony anyway. So of course when 1901 we became the Federation of Australia, the first act of Parliament was the Restricted Immigration Act of 1901. To most Australians this is better known as the White Australia policy. As a consequence, the numbers of Chinese in Western Australia was never very high prior to this act. We only ever had, I think, 1,600 at the turn of the century in 1900. So out of a population of almost 200,000, we're a very small percentage. As a consequence, when this new Act of Parliament came in, the numbers just dwindled off. And in 1954, when my parents came to settle in Western Australia, the census showed there were less than 200 Chinese in the entire state. When they first took it on, I don't think there was a great range of products, because what happened was the population was very small, so there wasn't great demand for things. But then after they started the business, we had the Colombo Plan come along in the 60s, and there were young Chinese students or Asian students coming in, and at the time we were the only surviving Chinese grocery shop. So they did start to expand what they got in. From what I can gather, I think the people coming to eat at the back of the shop weren't actually Chinese. They were actually Australians who had a day at the races and then wanted to go somewhere to eat. There were other cookhouses or restaurants around at the time, but generally they were frequented by the Chinese because James Street was a Chinatown in its own little right. I think the thing I've learnt from my parents being in the business and just my own life is that the Chinese are very flexible and adaptable. Post-Second World War, when we had that big influx of migrants, particularly from Europe, a lot of them had to take on different roles that they were not educated or brought up to do. A lot of them were in the fields that they were used to being in, but it was generally hard work. When the Chinese market gardeners were dying out, the Albanians came in York and other places. Italians and Greeks took up market gardening. And this is what I found interesting in my research of seeing how the local community in the early days were looking at the Chinese, and they were railing against the market gardeners. But I couldn't see that there were a lot of Australians taking it on. So I found that rather intriguing. I think Chinese are like a lot of groups. They encourage their children to try and do better. Nearly always you're meant to go to university and you're all meant to become doctors or something. But it shows how they've progressed from being just what we would call sojourners, where they weren't meant to stay. And now they do hold different positions in all sorts of levels of employment, and even they're starting now to show their place in government.